Welcome to Health Simplified. So we're going to do a deep dive today, and you sent over this really amazing collection of articles all about alcohol and its effects on the body. I mean, we've got stuff here from like MD Anderson and the NIA and WHO even. And I got to say, just looking through it all, it really struck me just how widespread the effects of alcohol really are. It's not just like one or two things. This stuff touches so many different parts of us.
Oh, absolutely. And that's really a key takeaway from the start, like right off the bat, whether someone's having just a casual drink or, if they're a more regular drinker, these sources all basically point to the same conclusion. Alcohol has some pretty significant and pretty varied effects throughout your system. And it's not really as simple as, one drink equals this outcome. Individuality really plays a huge role here.
Totally. It's almost like each of our bodies has its own little, personal rule book for processing and reacting to alcohol. And that rule book is influenced by all sorts of things, like how old you are, how much you weigh, even your genetics. But okay, let's get into some of the specifics, because there were some things that really jumped out at me. And one that was pretty much everywhere across the board was the link between alcohol and cancer risk.
Yeah, that connection is definitely something that comes up a lot in the research. MD Anderson and the NIA AWA, they specifically listed out a number of cancers that have been linked to alcohol consumption. Cancers of the oral cavity, the throat, esophagus, liver, breast, colon, rectum. Like you said, it's not just one or two, it's a whole range of cancers that can be affected. And the WHO, actually, they take this even further. They say that it's not just about heavy drinking. Even what many people would consider to be moderate alcohol consumption can actually increase your cancer risk. And they actually classify alcohol as a group 1 carcinogen. That's the same category as asbestos.
Wow. Okay, that's a really strong statement. It definitely challenges the idea that having a drink or two every now and then is totally harmless.
Yeah, I think there's this common misconception that a little bit of alcohol is fine, but the evidence really doesn't support that.
So MD Anderson, they also talk about why this connection exists. They mention that when our bodies break down ethanol, which is the alcohol we drink, it gets turned into this other substance called acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde, it can actually damage our DNA.
Right, and acetaldehyde, it's like a little tiny wrecking ball. It just goes in there and slams into your DNA, which is essentially the instruction manual for your cells. And over time, all that damage, it can cause errors in how cells grow. And that's a major driver of cancer. So it's not just the alcohol itself, it's what our bodies turn it into that really causes the problem.
Okay, so it's like this kind of double whammy situation. So we've talked about cancer, but the research also highlights how alcohol affects our brains. Kind of makes sense, right? Like we all know about getting tipsy and stuff.
Right.
But NI, EMO, and Healthline, they delve a little deeper into what's actually going on up there.
Yeah, so it's not just about feeling a little buzzed. Alcohol actually messes with the communication pathways in our brains. And, one source, NIDirect, they pointed out something that I thought was really interesting. They said that initially, alcohol actually might make you feel happier and more relaxed. Like those inhibitions kind of drop away. But then as your blood alcohol level starts to climb, that's when you start seeing the more obvious effects. Slurred speech, blurry vision trouble, walking straight. And then at MD Anderson, they highlight the long-term consequences of heavy drinking. And these can be serious, things like problems with learning and memory, higher risk of anxiety and depression, and even brain atrophy.
Brain atrophy. That doesn't sound good. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it basically means a shrinking of brain tissue. Like imagine you have a muscle that you never use. It's going to get smaller and weaker over time. And it's kind of same thing with the brain. If someone is a chronic heavy drinker, they can actually lose brain cells and connections.
Okay, that's kind of scary. And it's not just our minds that are at risk here. It seems like alcohol also has a pretty big impact on our hearts, too.
Yeah, NIAA and MD Anderson both had a lot to say about the risks that heavy drinking poses to heart health. Things like cardiomyopathy, arrhythmias, high blood pressure. And it's not just the extreme cases. The Curious Review, they specifically pointed out that even moderate alcohol consumption can increase the risk of atrial fibrillation. That's an irregular heartbeat.
So it seems like this whole idea that red wine is good for your heart, maybe that's not entirely accurate.
Yeah, that's a bit of a myth. The evidence really shows that alcohol is not heart healthy in the way that some people might believe. It's actually a significant risk factor for a lot of different heart problems.
Okay, so we can't talk about alcohol without talking about the liver.
Yeah.
It's the organ that has to do all the heavy lifting when it comes to processing alcohol, so it makes sense that it would take a hit.
Exactly. And, the sources really laid out this kind of step-by-step progression of liver damage that can happen with heavy drinking. It starts with something called fatty liver, and then if it continues, it can progress to things like alcoholic hepatitis fibrosis and eventually cirrhosis. And what's important to remember is that this isn't something that happens overnight. It's usually a slow and gradual process as the liver gets overworked trying to filter out all those toxins from the alcohol. It's kind of like, well, imagine your liver's like a filter. And with heavy alcohol use, it's like you're pouring way too much stuff through that filter. First, it gets all clogged up with fat. That's the fatty liver. And then if you keep pushing it, it gets inflamed. That's the hepatitis. And then eventually, scar tissue starts to build up. That's fibrosis. And that makes the filter less efficient. And finally gets so damaged that it can barely work at all. That's cirrhosis. And that's when things get really dangerous.
So it's like this downward spiral. It starts out kind of subtle, but it can lead to some really serious problems. And speaking of problems, it seems like the pancreas can also be affected by alcohol.
Yeah, there were a few mentions of something called pancreatitis, and that's a really painful inflammation of the pancreas.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's not fun. And NIATA, Healthline Curious, they all pointed out that alcohol can actually trigger the pancreas to produce toxic substances, which is what leads to that inflammation. And, pancreatitis isn't just painful. In some cases, it can become a chronic condition, and that can have lasting effects on how your body digests food.
So it's another example of how alcohol can just kind of mess with a delicate balance in our bodies. I was also surprised to see that our immune system can also be affected. Like, it can actually make us more vulnerable to getting sick.
Oh, absolutely. Drinking too much can really weaken your immune defenses. It's like it takes the soldiers off the front line. And that makes it harder for your body to fight off infections, things like pneumonia and tuberculosis. And the Curious Review actually suggested that even moderate alcohol consumption can have an impact on the immune system.
So even if you're not like a heavy drinker, it's still something to be mindful of. It's like alcohol is kind of a sneaky saboteur. It's working behind the scenes to weaken your body's defenses.
Yeah, it's not always obvious, but it's definitely there.
And the effects, they just keep going. It's like our digestive system, our sleep patterns, they could all be disrupted by alcohol.
Definitely. So alcohol, it can irritate the lining of your digestive tract, and that can actually make it harder for your body to absorb nutrients properly. And it can also lead to things like bloating and gas and even ulcers. And a lot of people, they think that having a drink before bed helps them sleep. But in reality, alcohol actually messes with your sleep cycle later in the night. So you might fall asleep easier, but the overall quality of your sleep is going to be worse.
So it's another one of those things where the short-term benefit can actually have negative consequences in the long run. And for anyone who's thinking about starting a family, there were some pretty serious warnings about the effects of alcohol on fertility and pregnancy.
Right. Alcohol can actually have a negative impact on fertility in both men and women. And during pregnancy, it's really crucial to avoid alcohol altogether. Even small amounts of alcohol can increase the risk of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And those disorders can have lifelong consequences for the child.
Wow. So there's really no safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy. It's something to take very seriously.
Definitely. It's just not worth the risk.
And it's also interesting to think about how alcohol affects our mental health. It seems like it can really worsen things like anxiety and depression.
Yeah, the relationship between alcohol and mental health is complicated. Some people, they turn to alcohol to try to cope with those feelings. But in the long run, it can actually make things worse. And it can even contribute to new mental health challenges during intoxication or withdrawal. It's a tricky situation.
Yeah, it's definitely not a solution. And finally, I was surprised to see that even our bones and muscles can be affected by long-term alcohol use. Like, it can weaken our bones and make our muscles weaker too.
Yeah, alcohol, it can decrease bone density, which can make people more prone to fractures. And it can also lead to muscle weakness and atrophy. So it really is a whole body impact.
It's amazing to me just how many different systems are affected. It's not just one or two things. It's like a cascade of potential problems.
Yeah, the sources you shared, they really highlight that alcohol has this really widespread and often negative influence on our health.
Yeah. And they also touch on some of the more immediate short-term effects that we've probably all heard of or even experienced firsthand. Things like lowered inhibitions, impaired coordination, nausea, and of course the dreaded hangover.
Right. And those hangovers, they're not just a minor inconvenience. Better Health Channel, they explain that hangovers are actually a result of several things happening in the body at once. Dehydration, inflammation, changes in blood sugar. It's basically your body's way of saying, hey, I'm trying to recover from all that alcohol you threw at me. And it's important to remember that drinking too much in a short period of time can also lead to alcohol poisoning, which can be really dangerous.
Yeah, alcohol poisoning is definitely something to take seriously. It's a medical emergency. So it's clear that there are a lot of risks associated with drinking alcohol. But I was really interested to see that there was a pretty clear consensus across the sources that the less alcohol you drink, the lower your risk of harm. And the WHO and the Australian government, they even provide specific guidelines for how much alcohol is considered to be low risk.
Yeah, those guidelines are really important. They reflect the understanding that there's not necessarily a safe level of alcohol consumption. It's more like a spectrum of risk. And even if you're not a heavy drinker, reducing your intake can still have significant benefits for your health. It's all about finding that balance.
Right. And it seems like there are a lot of individual factors that can influence how alcohol affects us too, like whether we drink on an empty stomach or even what kind of drinks we choose.
Exactly. Things like your body composition and how quickly you drink those can all play a role in how your body absorbs and processes the alcohol. So it's not just about how much you drink, it's also about how you drink.
So this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the effects of alcohol. It's clear that alcohol has a profound impact on our bodies and not always in a good way. We've covered everything from those immediate short-term effects to the long-term risk for our organs and even increased risk of cancer. And I think this information really highlights the importance of understanding our own relationship with alcohol and making informed choices about our health. So what stands out to you most from all of this information? And what further questions does this raise about alcohol's impact on our well-being? Thank you for taking the time out to listen to our deep dive. Until next time, stay healthy and stay informed.